She was sold for $1, not traded, not auctioned with dignity. Sold, in the middle of a dirt street, while men in dusty boots laughed and a woman in the crowd covered her mouth like the whole thing was too embarrassing to witness. Her name was Delaney Cross. She weighed more than what Red Ash considered beautiful, carried more scars than what Red Ash considered decent, and had a past that men used like a weapon every time she got too close to something good. Nobody wanted her, and then one man stepped forward and paid exactly $1 silver. Not to own her, to end it. If you've ever been counted out before someone even learned your name, stay with me. Hit that like button, drop the name of your city in the comments, and let me know how far this story travels. Now let's go. Red Ash, New Mexico Territory, August 1884. The summer that Delaney Cross arrived in Red Ash, the heat had already killed 2 cattle, dried up a creek that locals swore never ran dry, and driven the Baptist preacher so deep into his own misery that he'd stopped giving Sunday sermons entirely. It was that kind of summer, the kind that made men mean and made the mean ones worse. She came in on the back of a freight wagon, which was already an indignity, but what made it worse, what lodged itself in Delaney's chest like a splinter she couldn't reach, was the wooden signboard leaning against the wagon's side panel. Hand-lettered in black paint, crude and without apology. Unclaimed bride. Healthy, firm-tempered, reasonable offers. The wagon driver, a man named Gus Parley, who smelled of old tobacco and cheaper decisions, had nailed that sign up himself. He'd explained it to her back in Tucson with the weary tone of a man describing livestock feed. "You got left behind," he'd said. "Gentlemen, what ordered you never showed. I got costs to recoup." That was 3 days ago. 3 days of sitting in the back of that wagon on a wooden bench with her wrists rope burned and her dignity somewhere in the Arizona dust behind them. She hadn't cried. Not once. Delaney had learned, through methods she didn't care to catalog, that tears accomplished nothing except making men feel like they'd won something. So she sat straight, arms crossed, eyes forward. And when Gus Parley rolled that wagon into the center of Red Ash's main street and stopped in front of the Miners Exchange Saloon at 2:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, Delaney Cross did not flinch. She did, however, take a slow look around and quietly calculate how many of the men gathering on the boardwalks looked like the kind who could be outrun versus the kind who'd need to be reasoned with. It was not an encouraging calculation. Red Ash was not a beautiful town. It had the bones of ambition, a proper main street, 2-story buildings, a bank with a real glass window. But everything was coated in the same fine red dust that gave the town its name, and nothing had been painted in at least 5 years. The saloon sign hung crooked. The general store's porch had a broken board that nobody had gotten around to fixing. The whole place felt like it had started with high intentions and then gotten tired somewhere around 1879. The people matched the town. They gathered now the way people gather when something uncomfortable is about to happen, and they're not sure whether to feel bad about watching. Women in faded calico dresses clustered near the dry goods store, close enough to see but far enough back to pretend they hadn't come on purpose. Men leaned against hitching posts with their thumbs in their belts, squinting against the afternoon glare. A group of younger men, the kind who ran together and called it friendship, positioned themselves close to the wagon with the specific energy of people who had already decided to make something worse. Gus Parley climbed down from the wagon box and cleared his throat like a man who'd done this before and had long since stopped feeling anything about it. "All right," he called out, loud enough to carry down the street. "I got a situation here that needs resolving. Mail order arrangement fell through. I got a woman, I got expenses, and I got a need to get back on the road by sundown. Reasonable man with room and the means to support one more." "How much she weigh?" someone called out. It landed the way it was intended to land. There was laughter. Not everyone. A few people on the fringe looked away, suddenly interested in the middle distance. But enough. The cluster of young men near the wagon appreciated it loudly. Delaney did not look toward the voice. She kept her eyes on the far end of the street, on a spot above a building where a red-tailed hawk was circling on a thermal, indifferent to all of it. "That's the one with sense," she thought. "She's a working woman," Gus said, slightly uncomfortable now that the crowd had taken a tone he hadn't intended. He was dishonest and opportunistic, but he didn't particularly like cruelty. There's a distinction, even if it's a small one. Good with hands, strong back, cook, clean, manage a household. Did she eat the last husband? The same voice. More laughter. One of the women near the dry goods store, older, gray-haired, with a face like weathered leather, turned her back and walked inside. That registered with Delaney. Filed away. Starting price is $20, Gus said, rushing now, wanting this finished. $20 covers my costs, and I'll give you $5, a man said. He was heavy-set himself, with a red face and a mayor's self-importance. $5. And she does laundry for my establishment for 6 months. $7.50, said another, but she stays in the barn. I ain't got room in the house. The barn. Delaney felt something move through her then, not fear. She'd metabolized fear a long time ago, broken it down into something more useful. What moved through her was a cold, clarifying fury, the kind that makes everything slow and precise. She stood up in the wagon bed. She was not a small woman. She'd known that all her life, had been informed of it since childhood, by people who thought the information was somehow helpful. She was tall and broad and built along lines that her mother had called substantial, and the rest of the world had called something less charitable. Her hair was dark brown and needed work after 3 days on the road. Her dress, her best one, worn for an arrival she'd spent 6 months mentally preparing for, was dusty and creased and had a small tear at the left sleeve from when she'd caught it on the wagon's ironwork. She stood up in that wagon and she let them look. $7.50 in a barn, she said. Her voice was level, conversational almost. Is that where we are? It wasn't a question. The heavy-set man with the red face blinked. Now hold on. No. She looked at him with the specific focus of someone who has decided that the social cost of backing down is no longer worth calculating. $7.50 and a barn. And before that, somebody wanted to know how much I weigh. Before that, somebody asked if I ate the last husband. She let her gaze move through the crowd slowly. Mr. Parley, how much did you say you needed to cover your costs? Gus Parley, to his credit, looked like a man who was deeply reconsidering his life choices. Ma'am, how much? $15 would... $15. She repeated it clearly. So what's happening right now is that a group of grown men is trying to negotiate the price of a human being down to less than the cost of a decent horse, to place that human being in a barn, and are apparently doing this in front of their wives and children. She paused. I want to make sure I have this correct. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of the young men near the wagon, late teens, wiry, with the specific look of someone who has never once experienced a consequence, said, Lady, ain't nobody gonna pay full price for... Son. The voice came from the left. Everyone looked. Delaney looked too. She almost hadn't noticed him. He'd been standing at the edge of the crowd, apart from the men at the hitching posts, leaning against the wall of the assay office with his arms folded and his hat pushed back on his head. He wasn't the tallest man present or the broadest. He was somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of face that came from years of outdoor work, weathered but not broken, jaw sharp under a few days of dark stubble. He wore a plain dark coat over a work shirt, no badge, no obvious decoration. His boots were good quality but showed real use. He'd pushed off the wall and was walking toward the wagon now, unhurried. The young man who'd been speaking had stopped speaking. The man didn't look at the crowd. He walked directly to Gus Parley, reached into his coat pocket, and produced a silver dollar. He held it out. Gus stared at it. Sir, I said 15, but the smart must bum. I heard what you said. The man's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. I'm giving you $1, which is already more than what's being offered for a performance like this. He looked at Parley steadily. Take it. There was a beat. Gus Parley took the dollar. The man turned to the wagon and looked up at Delaney. Up close, he had gray at his temples and eyes that were dark and direct, and didn't do anything they weren't doing on purpose. Ma'am, he said, if you'd like to step down, I'll take you somewhere you can get cleaned up and eat a real meal. No obligation past that. You can decide what's next after you've had a chance to think straight. Delaney Cross looked at him for a long moment. She'd heard good offers before. She knew what they usually cost. You'll regret this, she said quietly. Not as a warning, exactly, more like information she felt he deserved to have. Choosing me. He didn't hesitate, not for a heartbeat. I regret standing here as long as I did, he said. That's the only regret I've got today. From behind them, someone in the crowd laughed. Not meanly, the way people laugh when something happens that doesn't fit the narrative they expected. The man didn't acknowledge it. He simply offered his hand to help her down from the wagon. Delaney looked at the hand, then she climbed down on her own, stood beside him on the dust of Red Ash's main street. I'm Delaney Cross, she said. Boone Mercer, he said. I've got a ranch about 4 miles out. You're welcome to it for as long as you need. He turned and walked. She walked beside him. Nobody followed. Chunt. His horse was a big roan gelding tied at the rail outside the assay office. Solid animal, well kept, with the calm temperament of a horse that had been ridden by someone patient. Boone untied him without ceremony, looked at Delaney, and said, Can you ride? Yes. You can take Red. I'll walk. That's not necessary. Red won't mind doubling up if you don't. She looked at the horse. The horse looked back at her with what appeared to be complete indifference to the entire situation, which she found more comforting than most things she'd encountered today. Fine, she said. She got up on the roan with more ease than Boone had maybe expected, and he swung up behind her without comment, and they moved off down the main street of Red Ash at an easy walk. As they passed the dry goods store, Delaney caught a glimpse of a face in the window. The older woman who'd walked away earlier, gray-haired, with the weathered face. The woman met her eyes for a moment. She gave a small nod. Delaney didn't return it, but she noted it. Well, they didn't talk much on the ride out. Boone pointed out landmarks with the brief efficiency of a man giving information rather than making conversation. The creek line to the north, the ridge that marked the edge of his grazing land, a bent mesquite tree that he used as a waypoint in low visibility. Delaney listened and watched the terrain and kept her hands easy on the saddle horn. The land was hard and beautiful in the way that land is beautiful when it doesn't care about you. Big sky, red rock, distances that went on until they became philosophy. After 3 days in the back of a wagon, it felt nearly physical, that openness, like being let out of something. After about 2 miles, she asked, Do you do that often? Do what often? Pay $1 for women in public auctions. He was quiet for a moment. Never done it before today. What made today different? Another pause. She had the sense that he was considering how to say something rather than whether to say it. You stood up, he said finally, in that wagon, and you said what you said, and not one person in that crowd said a word back, which means every one of them knew you were right and were too embarrassed to admit it out loud. He shifted his weight slightly. Figured the least someone could do was act like it. Delaney thought about that. You didn't know anything about me, she said. No. I could be anyone, he said. Yeah. Same's true of pretty much everybody. A beat. I'll take my chances. She didn't have an answer for that. She turned her face toward the horizon and watched the ranch come into view ahead. Low buildings, a barn, corrals, the particular ordered spread of a working operation, and felt something that she recognized after a moment as the faint, cautious shape of possibility. She didn't trust it, but she didn't dismiss it either. The ranch was called the Mercer Stake, which was not a romantic name, but was an honest one. It sat on 40 acres of mixed grassland and scrub, with a main house that was solidly built, if not elegant, a good-sized barn, a bunkhouse where 3 hands lived, a vegetable garden that needed work, and a windmill that squeaked on every revolution in a rhythm that Delaney would come to know the way you know a clock's tick. The hands? 3 men named Cal, who was 50 and built like a fence post. Rodrigo, who was 23 and spoke more Spanish than English, and a young man everyone called Patch, for reasons that became obvious, looked at Delaney's arrival with expressions ranging from confusion to careful neutrality. Boone said to no one in particular, Miss Cross will be staying in the main house until she decides on her next move. Treat her accordingly. That was the entire introduction. Cal said, Yes, sir, with the tone of a man who'd worked for Boone long enough to trust that if there was an explanation, it would arrive when it was needed. Rodrigo looked at Delaney, then looked at his boots, then looked back at her and said, I can move the good water bucket closer to the house if you want. It's heavy. I'll manage, Delaney said. Rodrigo nodded seriously. You will, he agreed, as if this were a settled fact. Patch just stared at her with open curiosity until Cal told him to go fix the pasture fence. Basum. The room Boone showed her to was at the back of the house, off the kitchen. It was small but clean, with a real bed, not a cot, an actual bed frame with a rope mattress and a proper quilt, a washstand, a window that faced west, and a door that had a latch on the inside. Boone showed her the latch specifically. Works from in here, he said, demonstrating. I won't knock unless there's a fire or a flood, both of which have happened. Delaney looked at him. Neither was my fault, he said. She almost smiled, stopped herself. Thank you, she said. The words were strange in her mouth, not because she was ungrateful, but because she'd said them so many times in her life as a shield and a performance that she'd nearly forgotten what they felt like when she meant them. Supper's at 6, Boone said. You're not obligated to join, but Rodrigo cooks on Wednesdays, and he's better than he looks. He pulled the door closed behind him. She stood in the quiet room for a moment, listening to the house settle around her. The windmill squeaked its slow rhythm outside. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted its weight. From the kitchen came the distant, ordinary sound of water being poured. Delaney sat down on the edge of the bed. She pressed her palms flat on the quilt. She let herself breathe. Just that. Just breathe. In a room with a latched door and a window that faced west and nobody outside it who wanted something from her. She sat like that for a long time. She came to supper. Rodrigo had made a beef stew that was genuinely good, heavily seasoned in ways that she associated with south of the border, and that made the food taste like it had an opinion. There were biscuits that were not quite right, but were made with real effort. The four of them sat at the kitchen table, Boone at the head, Cal to his left, Rodrigo and Patch across, and a fifth plate had been set across from Boone, which was where Delaney sat. Nobody stared. Nobody asked pointed questions. Cal talked about the fence line issue that had been ongoing for 2 weeks. Rodrigo asked Boone about a neighboring rancher named Holt, who owed him lumber. Patch ate with the single-minded focus of a young man who takes food very seriously. Delaney ate and listened and said very little. After a while, Patch looked up from his plate and said to her directly, "You're the one from the street today." "Patch," Cal said. "I heard about it," Patch said. "People were talking in town." He looked at Delaney without any particular discomfort. "They said Boone paid $1. "That's correct," Delaney said. Patch nodded thoughtfully. "That's real low," he said. There was a short silence. "He means the offer," Boone said. "Not—" "I understood what he meant," Delaney said. She looked at Patch. "It was low." Patch looked satisfied. "That's what I thought. That's real disrespectful." He picked up his biscuit. "You should stay," he announced. "We need help with the garden. Cal killed the last 3 tomato plants." "I was watering them," Cal said, with the quiet defensiveness of a man who has lost this argument before. "You drowned them," Rodrigo said. "The soil here needs different treatment than what you're used to," Delaney said. Everyone looked at her. She hadn't planned to say it. It had come out the way things do when you know something and the moment opens up. Red clay base holds too much moisture. You need to cut it with sand and let the drainage work. Water less, deeper, early morning. Silence. "You know gardening," Cal said. "My grandmother's land in Georgia." She looked back at her plate. "Different soil, same principle." Boone was watching her with an expression she couldn't read, not the calculating look she'd grown accustomed to reading, the look that men used when they were figuring out what she was good for. Something quieter than that. She didn't know what to do with something quieter than that. "The garden's yours if you want it," he said. "No obligation, but it'd be useful." "I'll look at it tomorrow," she said, and that was how Delaney Cross came to stay at the Mercer stake. Not with drama or negotiation or the signing of any paper. Just a garden. Just tomorrow. The first 2 weeks were mostly silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Something more purposeful than that. The ranch operated on its own rhythm, and Delaney found herself slowly fitting herself into that rhythm the way you find the right posture for a chair that wasn't made for you. She woke early, before anyone else, and sat with coffee at the kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn, and had the house to herself for exactly 1 hour. That hour became necessary, a buffer between sleep, where everything she'd survived came calling, and the day, where she could keep things moving and not have to sit with it. She worked the garden. Cal had indeed drowned the tomatoes, but the soil was salvageable, and she hauled in sand from the creek bed and rebuilt the beds and replanted and watched with something close to satisfaction as the seedlings she'd started indoors began to take. She helped with cooking on the days Rodrigo wasn't, which quickly became most days, because it turned out Rodrigo's skills peaked on Wednesdays and struggled elsewhere. She washed her own clothes and didn't ask for help, and didn't offer more than she was ready to give. Boone left her alone. Not coldly. She would have known that cold. He was present. He passed through the kitchen in the mornings and said good morning, and meant it. He asked at supper if she needed anything, and the asking was genuine rather than performative. He helped her move the heavy planting troughs without being asked and without making a production of it. When she came back late one evening from checking the far edge of the garden and nearly walked into him coming out the side door, he said, "Sorry," and stepped aside immediately, and that small automatic stepping aside did something she hadn't expected. It made her feel like she had space that belonged to her. She hadn't had that in a long time, but she didn't let herself be easy about it. She was careful. She watched for the moment when the generosity would come with a bill attached, when the distance would close in a way she didn't choose. She'd been given things before, and she knew what happened when the giving stopped feeling sufficient to the giver. The bill didn't come. The distance stayed exactly where it was. She started, against her better judgment, to sleep through the night. She'd had a journal since she was 15. Not one continuous journal. She'd had to leave them behind too many times. But she always found a new one eventually. The current one was a battered leather cover she'd bought in Tucson, and the pages were 3/4 full. In the third week at the ranch, she wrote, "I don't know what he wants. That's the thing. I keep looking for it and I can't find it, and I'm not sure if that's because it's hidden or because it isn't there. He's not pretending to be a saint. He's short-tempered with the fence situation, and he was rude to the man from the bank who came about the timber loan, and he eats with his elbows on the table, which my mother would have had opinions about. He's just a person. I'm not used to just a person. I'm used to men who are projects dressed up as rescuers." She set the pen down and looked out the window. Wrote, "There is something else. There is a thing I carry that I have never put into this much writing, because if I write it down I have to look at it. And looking at it is a thing I have been very successfully not doing for going on 4 years." She looked at the page for a long time. Then she closed the journal without writing more. Not yet. She went into Red Ash for the first time in the 4th week, alone. Boone offered to come, and she said no, and he accepted that without argument, which was the right call. She went to the general store for seed supplies and the dry goods for thread, and she kept her expression level and her head up, and she did not acknowledge the looks. There were looks. She had learned to catalog them without reacting. There were looks that were curious, looks that were dismissive, and looks that were the specific look of people who had witnessed something and are deciding how to feel about their part in it. The man behind the general store counter, heavy-set, efficient, not unkind, said, "You're the woman from the wagon." "I am," she said. "You staying at Mercer's place?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, wrote up her purchase without fuss. "Boone's a decent man," he said, as if this were relevant information she'd asked for. She gathered her purchases. "I'll remember you said so," she said, which was not agreement or disagreement, but landed somewhere in between. She was loading the supplies onto the roan outside when the voice came from behind her. "Mercer's pity case." She didn't turn around, kept working the ties. "That's what people are calling you." 2 voices now, male, the kind of men who gather courage from company. "His dollar bride." She tightened the tie on the left saddlebag. "You know he's going to figure it out eventually," one said. He'd moved closer. She could hear the boards of the walkway. "When the good feeling wears off, he'll put you back out on the street. Ain't nobody keeping a woman like—" Say the rest of that sentence. It came from across the street. Boone was there. He hadn't said he was going to town. She turned and looked at him. He was standing in the middle of the street with his hands loose at his sides and a look on his face that she had not seen before. He was not yelling. He was not reaching for the gun at his hip. He was just standing there with that look. And it was, she thought, considerably more frightening than yelling. "Say the rest of it," he said again. I want to hear it completed. The two men on the boardwalk, she could see them now, mid-30s, the kind of men who work jobs that require just enough responsibility to give them opinions, looked at each other. One of them said, "Boone, we were just—" "I know what you were doing." He walked across the street without hurrying, stopped at the edge of the boardwalk. "She walks beside me," he said. He wasn't looking at the men now. He was looking at the street, the visible public street, as if he were addressing Red Ash itself. "Every time she comes into this town, she walks beside me. Or she walks on her own. And either way, she walks like a person who lives here. You forget that—" He looked at the man who'd spoken. "You answer to me. Are we clear?" Not a question. The man looked at the ground. "Yeah," he muttered. "Clear." "Good." Boone walked to where she stood by the roan. "I said I'd come alone," Delaney said. "You did," he agreed. "I had business at the assay office. I didn't follow you." She looked at him. "That's true," he said. "The assay office is 2 doors down." She couldn't tell if it was true. His expression was entirely neutral. "Don't lie to me," she said. "I won't," he said, immediately, without the pause that would have told her he was calibrating. She held his eyes for a moment. "Thank you," she said. And then, before she could stop it, "I could have handled it." "I know," he said. "I don't need— I know that too." He took the roan's reins and held them while she mounted. "I didn't do it because you needed me to. I did it because I wanted to. There's a difference." He handed the reins up to her. "You can be annoyed about it if you want." She looked down at him from the saddle. "I'll think about it," she said. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile. She turned the roan and headed for the edge of town. Or the things she hadn't written about in the journal. She'd thought about it in the wagon. She'd thought about it in the first sleepless nights at the ranch, lying in the dark with the windmill making its squeaking arc. She thought about it now, in quiet moments when there was nothing between her and it. Her sister's name was Clara. Clara was 7 years younger, which meant she'd been 11 when everything fell apart. And Delaney had been 18, and their mother had been dead 8 months, and their father had been the kind of man who took whatever a situation offered without considering what it cost. He'd taken an offer. The offer had come from a man named Silas Vane, who operated in the gray space between labor arrangement and something worse, who recruited women and girls for what he called domestic placement, and what he actually meant was something that Delaney, at 18, hadn't fully understood until she was already inside it. She'd agreed because the alternative was watching Clara starve. She'd agreed because Vane had promised, with papers, that Clara would be kept separately, kept safe, placed with a family. She'd agreed, and she'd spent 6 months in Vane's operation before she found a way out, and when she'd gone back for Clara wasn't where they'd put her. She'd never found out exactly what happened next. She'd found a girl who'd been in the same placement, who'd told her things in fragments and half-sentences and a face that couldn't quite make itself look at Delaney while speaking. She'd understood enough. Claire had been 11, and Delaney had put her in Vane's hands. That was the thing she didn't write down. She'd been surviving. She'd been desperate. She'd been 18 and terrified, and she'd believed a paper and a man's word. And she had carried the consequence of those facts like a stone sewn into her chest for going on 4 years. She'd told herself 100 versions of the story. She'd tried the version where she was a child herself and had done what she could. She'd tried the version where it was their father's fault, which it mostly was. She'd tried the version where she couldn't have known. None of them made it lighter. Because at the end of every version, Clara was still 11, and Delaney had still signed the paper. Whoosh. She woke in the night to the sound of wind picking up, and lay in the dark room with the quilt pulled close and felt the weight of it. All of it. The ranch was quiet. The windmill squeaked its steady rhythm. She thought about Boone at the dry goods store, looking at the street with that expression. She walks beside me. She thought about what it would mean if someone who had stood there and said that knew the whole of what she carried. She thought about how they always left when they knew, not always with cruelty. Sometimes they just quietly rearranged themselves until there was distance where there hadn't been before. It was almost kinder that way. Almost. She turned onto her side. She thought, I will not think about Silas Vane in this house. She thought, I will put myself together in this place, and I will figure out what's next, and I will do it without falling apart. She lay in the dark until the thought of Vane began to recede, replaced by the ordinary sounds of the ranch at night, the horses in the barn, the distant coyotes, the windmill, the wind moving through the mesquite. She did not fall apart. She lay there and breathed and waited for morning. And in the morning she got up and she made coffee and she sat in the kitchen in the pre-dawn quiet and she had her hour. Just that. Just tomorrow. The 5th week, she found the newspaper. It was a Tucson paper, 2 weeks old, left on the kitchen table by someone, Cal probably, who made occasional trips to town for parts and occasionally brought back reading material. She almost didn't look at it. The headline on the 3rd page was small. Territorial authorities investigating disappearances near Yavapai County. The paragraph beneath was brief, the kind of brief that newspapers used when they had information they didn't fully understand or weren't sure they were permitted to print. A name, in passing. Among several persons of interest, Silas Vane. Delaney sat very still for a moment. The kitchen was empty. Boone was out early. Rodrigo and the others were at the barn. She read the paragraph 3 more times. Then she folded the paper carefully, replaced it on the table, went to her room, and opened her journal to the page she'd left blank. And she began to write. He's still operating. I don't know what I thought happened to him after I got out. I think I told myself that someone else would handle it, that the law would find him, that what happened was part of a past I could leave behind if I walked far enough from it. He's still operating. Clara is 15 now, or would be. I don't know where Clara is. I have not let myself follow that thought to its end, because following it to its end is a place I may not be able to come back from. I am sitting in a room with a door that latches from the inside. I am sitting in a room that has been more of a home to me in 5 weeks than most places I have been in 4 years, and I am trying to decide what kind of person I am. Am I the kind of person who found something safe and stays small inside it? Or am I the kind of person who does the thing that should have been done before? She sat with that for a long time. Then she closed the journal. Outside, the windmill turned. The morning opened up around the ranch like something beginning, and Delaney Cross sat at the edge of a decision that was going to cost her something. She could feel it, the way you feel weather changing, and she let herself sit with it until she knew what she was going to do. She already knew. She'd known since she saw the name. The question was only whether she was honest enough to admit it to herself. She was. She opened the journal again, wrote one more line. I'm going to find him. Then she capped the ink, stood up, and went to start breakfast. The windmill squeaked. The sun came full over the ridge. The Mercer stake came alive around her, ordinary and real. And somewhere in the territory, Silas Vane was still moving. Not for long. The newspaper stayed on the kitchen table for 3 more days before Cal took it out to use as fire starter. Delaney watched it go without a word. She didn't need it anymore. The name was already inside her, sitting in the same place where she kept everything she couldn't afford to let out in public. Silas Vane. She went about her days. She watered the garden in the early morning, deep and slow the way the red clay needed. She cooked. She helped Rodrigo fix a section of the barn roof that had been threatening to let in weather. She did all of it with the same steady efficiency she'd always used to keep moving when something underneath her was shifting. But she was thinking. Every hour of every day she was thinking. She knew what Vane's operation looked like from the inside. She knew how he moved, never staying in one county long enough to give the law a clean target, rotating his people through different towns, using legitimate-looking paperwork to cover transactions that were anything but. She knew the kind of men he kept around him, the kind who were loyal not because of anything admirable, but because Vane paid well and asked no questions about what they'd done before. She knew one other thing. She knew that nobody who'd escaped his operation had ever gone back toward it voluntarily, which meant nobody had given the law what they'd need to actually shut it down. Eyewitness accounts from women who'd been through it, specific locations, names of the men he used as intermediaries. That was the kind of evidence that turned a person of interest mentioned in a newspaper into something that ended with bars. She was working through all of this on a Tuesday morning, hands deep in the garden soil, when Boone crouched down at the edge of the bed and said, "You've been somewhere else for about a week." She looked up at him. He wasn't accusing her. He said it the way someone says something they've been observing and have finally decided to mention, factually, without pressure behind it. "I'm here," she said. "Physically," he said. "Yeah." She pulled a weed and set it aside. Her hands were dirty to the wrist. "There are things I'm working through." "All right." It's not about you, or this place." "I didn't assume it was." He was quiet for a moment, watching her work. "You don't have to tell me. But if it's something I can help with, I'd rather know than not." Delaney sat back on her heels. She looked at him across the garden bed. This man who'd paid $1 to end her humiliation and asked nothing for it, who'd told a street full of people that she walked beside him, who'd given her a room with a latch and a garden and supper at 6 and had left it entirely at that. She thought about what it would cost to tell him. She thought about what it would cost not to. "The man who ran the operation I came out of," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "His name is Silas Vane. He's still working. I saw it in the Tucson paper Cal brought." Boone didn't say anything. He was listening the way some people can listen, completely, without preparing his response while she was still talking. "I spent 6 months in what he called a placement arrangement," she continued. "I was 18. I thought I was buying safety for my sister." She kept her eyes on the soil. "I was wrong about that. And I got out eventually, and I left, and I told myself that was the end of it." She paused. "It wasn't the end of it." "Your sister," Boone said quietly. "Clara." The name came out different than other words, thinner. "She was 11. I don't know where she is now. I don't know." She stopped, started again. "There's a version of this where I found a way out and left a child behind me. And then I spent 4 years running from that fact. And now I'm sitting in your garden, and Silas Vane is still operating, and that version is the one I have to live with." The silence that followed was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of something real sitting in the air between two people. "That's not the whole story," Boone said. "It's the part I'm responsible for. You were 18 and desperate, and someone lied to you. That doesn't... I'm not saying it makes it nothing," he said carefully. "I'm saying it's not the whole story. There's a difference." Delaney dug her fingers into the soil. "It doesn't change where Clara ended up." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He didn't try to reframe that. She respected him for it. "What are you thinking about doing?" She looked at him. "I know people in this territory," he said. "I know where information tends to pool, and I've heard the name Vane before, so not directly, but it moves through certain conversations." He met her eyes. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking I have things nobody else who's dealt with him has. I was inside it long enough to know how it works. I know names. I know routes. I know how his paperwork is structured." She paused. "That's the kind of thing that could actually close him down if it got to the right people." "Or it's the kind of thing that gets you killed if the wrong people find out you have it," Boone said. Not harshly, just the fact of it. "Yes," she said. "That too." He was quiet for a moment, then, "When you say you're thinking about doing something, what exactly are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I need to find out where he's operating out of now. I'm thinking I need to make contact with whoever in the territorial authority is actually pursuing this, not just writing names in newspapers." She paused. "I'm thinking I've been running for 4 years, and I'm tired of the direction I've been running." Boone looked at her for a long time, long enough that she couldn't read what was underneath it. "All right," he said. "All right, what?" "All right, let's figure out where he is." She stared at him. "You're not going to tell me it's dangerous." "I just did tell you it was dangerous. You said that too, which means you already know and you're doing it anyway." He stood up, brushed the dust from his knee. "I'm not in the business of talking people out of things they've already decided are right. Seems like a waste of both our time." Delaney stood too. She was almost his height, which she'd noticed before and which he seemed entirely unbothered by. "I'm not asking you to get involved in this," she said. "I know you're not." He picked up the watering can she'd set down and moved it out of the path. "I'm involving myself. There's a difference." She wanted to argue with that. She could feel the argument ready, the one about not needing anyone, about not wanting someone else's risk on her conscience, about the particular exhaustion of people who involved themselves and then expected something for it later. She looked at his face. He wasn't expecting anything. She could see that. It wasn't performed patience. It was genuine, uncomplicated willingness. The kind that comes from people who have decided who they are and are not performing it for an audience. I'll think about it, she said, which was the closest she'd come to yes in a long time. That night after supper, when Rodrigo and Patch had gone to the bunkhouse and Cal was reading by the lamp in the front room, Boone spread a territory map on the kitchen table, and they stood over it in the lamplight, and Delaney began to tell him, precisely and without flinching, what she knew. She told him about the routes Vane used between Yavapai and the Eastern Territories. She told him about the intermediaries, men who ran legitimate freight operations as cover, who processed Vane's paperwork through their own. She told him about a specific location she'd heard referenced repeatedly during her time in the operation, a canyon system east of a town called Bridle that Vane's men used for transfers. Boone listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical and specific. He made no expressions of shock or pity. He treated the information the way a man treats information that matters, carefully, with his full attention. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Black Ridge Canyon, he said. That's what they call the Bridle system. I know it. You've been there? Once, years back, following strayed cattle. He looked at the map. It's rough country. Easy to miss a man in it if he doesn't want to be found. Easy to miss an operation, she said. Yeah. He traced a route with his finger. There's a man in Bridle, name of Harker. He runs the telegraph office, but he's got more of an ear for territory movement than most sheriffs. If Vane's running anything through that canyon, Harker would have pieces of it. Is he trustworthy? Boone considered. He's practical. He doesn't like people who make his territory complicated. I'd say that makes him reliable for our purposes, if not exactly trustworthy in the larger sense. Our purposes. She noticed the word and said nothing about it. How long to get to Bridle? She asked. Day and a half, easy ride. 2 if the creek's high. He looked up from the map. We'd need to go soon if we're going. These things have a way of moving. She looked at the map, at the canyon system marked east of Bridle, the ridge lines, the creek branches. I need to think about it overnight, she said. Fine. And I need to think about whether... She stopped. Whether what? She met his eyes. Whether this is going to get you killed on account of something that's my problem to solve. He held her gaze. Let me be real clear about something, he said. You didn't bring Silas Vane into this territory. He was already here. What you have is information that could stop him from doing to other girls what he did to Clara. That's not your problem to solve alone. That's a problem that belongs to anyone with the means to help solve it. A pause. I've got means. She looked at him for a moment. You're going to be very difficult to argue with, she said. I've been told, he said. She almost smiled. Got halfway there. She went to bed and lay in the dark and turned it over and over and arrived. By the time the windmill had made its circuit 100 times, at the same place she always arrived when she was honest with herself. She was going, and she was going to let him ride beside her, not because she needed him to, because the thing she'd been running from had a name and a location, and she was done running, and because, and this was the part she only admitted to herself in the complete dark with the windmill going, she was tired of being alone inside her own determination, just tired. In the morning, she came to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one across the table where Boone was already sitting with the map. He looked at the cup. Day and a half, she said. You said easy ride. He wrapped both hands around the cup. We can leave Thursday. Thursday, she agreed. And that was that. That? The next 2 days had a different quality to them. Not tense, exactly. Something more focused. Boone spoke to Cal about the ranch in his absence, calm and specific. The kind of instructions that came from a man who'd left before and knew what needed to be said. Delaney sorted through what she had, her journal, the careful notes she'd made over years from memory, the names she hadn't written anywhere but kept in her head the way you keep things you can't afford to lose. On Wednesday evening, Rodrigo appeared at the kitchen door while she was putting together supplies. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of a man trying to figure out how to begin. I know you're going somewhere, he said finally. Errands, she said. He leaned against the doorframe. In this territory, errands don't need 2 horses and the rifle case. She looked at him. He was 23 and young in the face, but not in the eyes. His eyes had the quality of someone who'd arrived in this country with a history and had learned when to ask questions and when to know the answer already. "You'll be careful," he said. It wasn't a question either. "I'll be careful," she said. He nodded, started to go, then turned back. "That thing in town," he said. "The man from the wagon. Whatever you went through before here." He looked for words and didn't quite find the ones he wanted, which she thought was honest. "You're not that anymore. Whatever you think it made you. You're not only that." She held the supply bag still in her hands. "Thank you, Rodrigo," she said. He shrugged, slightly embarrassed at his own sincerity. "I just don't want you to go thinking you owe the past something you don't owe it," he said. And then he went back to the bunkhouse. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. She thought about debt and what she owed and what she didn't. She thought about Clara at 11 and Silas Vane's paperwork and 4 years of distance that hadn't made any of it smaller. She finished packing the bag. She wasn't going because she owed the past. She was going because she'd finally stopped being afraid of it. Thursday came gray and cool, which was a mercy in August. They rode out before sunup, before the ranch was fully awake, and the land was all purple shadow and the smell of cooling stone. And for the first hour they rode in easy silence, and Delaney felt, for the first time in a long time, like she was moving toward something instead of away. They were 2 hours out when Boone said, "Tell me about Clara. Not about Vane, about her." Delaney looked at the horizon. "She was funny," she said after a moment. "Funnier than me. She used to do impressions of our neighbors. She'd get the voices exactly right and then look completely innocent when they turned around." A pause. "She liked birds. She could identify them by the sound. She'd grab my arm when she heard one and make me stand still until I heard it too." Another pause. "She was going to be something." Boone said nothing, just listened. "She's still going to be something," Delaney said. "I have to believe that." "Then believe it," he said simply. The horses moved. The land opened ahead of them. The gray light was starting to shift toward gold at the edges of the sky. They rode. Bridle was smaller than Red Ash and meaner about it. It sat at the junction of 2 dry creek beds like something dropped there by accident and never retrieved. A collection of maybe 40 buildings, if you counted the ones that were more lean-to than structure. The main street was unpaved, even by frontier standards, just packed dirt with ruts deep enough to swallow a wheel. And the few people moving through it had the particular walk of folks who had learned not to make eye contact with strangers. They rode in mid-afternoon of the second day, having camped the previous night on a flat shelf of rock above a dry wash where Boone had built a small fire, and they'd eaten beans and hardtack and spoken very little. The silence between them had settled into something workable by then. Not the careful silence of 2 people avoiding something, but the more ordinary silence of people who had enough to think about and trusted the other to be there when the thinking was done. Parker's telegraph office was at the north end of the main street, identifiable by the wire running from a crooked pole on the roof. The man himself was behind a low counter when they walked in. Late 50s, lean, with the permanently squinting expression of someone who'd spent decades reading small print in bad light. He looked at Boone first, then at Delaney, then back at Boone. "Mercer," he said. Not warmly, but not unwelcomingly either. The voice of a man who dealt in information and therefore treated arrivals as potential transactions. "Parker." Boone set his hat on the counter. "Need some information." "Most people do." Parker's eyes moved to Delaney again. "Who's she?" "Someone who knows more about what I'm asking than I do," Boone said. Parker considered this. "What are you asking?" "Silas Vane," Delaney said. The name landed. She watched Parker's face carefully. She'd gotten good over the years at reading the specific kind of reaction that name produced in people. There was the reaction of people who didn't know it, which was blankness. There was the reaction of people who knew it from a distance, which was a careful neutrality. And there was the reaction of people who knew it up close, which was something that moved through the eyes fast and then got controlled. Parker had the third reaction. He looked at the door behind them, then at the window. Old habit, she thought, the kind you develop when you've been in places where being overheard costs you. "Shut the door," he said. Boone closed it. Parker came around the counter and stood in the middle of the small room with his arms folded. He looked at Delaney with a different quality of attention now, assessing rather than dismissing. "What do you know about Vane?" he said to her. 6 months of his operation from the inside, she said. Names, routes, how he structures his transfers. The canyon system east of here that his men use for staging. She paused. What do you know? Another beat of assessment. Then something in Harker's posture shifted. The slight deflation of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just seen someone offer to help carry it. There's a deputy territorial marshal out of Prescott, he said. Name of Aldridge. He's been building a case for 2 years. He's got freight records and some testimony from a man Vane used to run paperwork, but the man's testimony alone isn't enough. He was inside the operation. Jury dismiss him as self-interested. Awesome. Harker looked at Delaney. What you're describing, an eyewitness account with operational detail, from someone with no criminal exposure. That's what Aldridge has been missing. Can you get word to him? Boone said. I can get a wire to his office in Prescott in 20 minutes. Harker paused. But there's something else you need to know. He went back behind the counter and produced a folded paper. A message, received within the last few days by the look of the fold marks. Vane's men have been through here twice in the last month, Harker said, moving something through the canyon at night, which is not what you do when everything is above board. Last time through, they had 3 wagons and enough outriders to make clear that nobody should ask about the cargo. He looked at the paper. I don't know what they're moving or when the next run is, but based on the pattern, it's soon. Delaney felt the information arrange itself alongside what she already knew. 3 wagons, night movement, outriders. That was a transit run, not a staging, which meant Vane was moving people, not just money. And if he was doing it at that scale, he had a buyer waiting somewhere on the other end. How soon? She said. Could be this week, Harker said. Could be they've already gone. I don't have eyes on the canyon. I do, Boone said. Both Harker and Delaney looked at him. I told you I've been there before, he said to her. I know the approach terrain. If there's staging in the canyon, there's only 3 ways in and 1 good way out if you're moving wagons. He turned to Harker. Send the wire to Aldridge. Tell him what we've told you and that we're going to the canyon to confirm what's there. Tell him to move. Harker looked at him for a long moment. Mercer. The men Vane keeps around him aren't hands-in-the-air types. You go into that canyon and they see you. Send the wire, Boone said. Harker sent the wire. They left the horses at the livery and took a room at the boarding house. 2 rooms, which Boone arranged without discussion on the matter. And Delaney sat on the edge of the single bed in hers and thought through everything Harker had said and everything she knew and felt the shape of it, solidifying into something urgent. She didn't sleep much. At some point in the night, she heard Boone's floorboards creak. He was awake too, moving to the window probably, which is what she'd been doing every hour or so. The listening quality of a building at night when you're not sure what you're listening for. In the morning, they rode for the canyon. The approach to Black Ridge was through broken country, dry arroyos, stands of juniper, the occasional outcrop of red rock that gave the territory its characteristic look of violence interrupted. Boone navigated it with the ease of someone working from memory rather than a map, which she noted and filed. They were maybe a mile out when he stopped the horses without warning. She stopped beside him. What? He nodded ahead. She followed his sightline, a smear of dust above the ridgeline, thin and dissipating. Recent movement. Wagon, he said quietly. Which direction? Into the canyon, by the look of it. He watched the dust settle. Not out. That meant they weren't too late. Delaney felt something that was part relief and part the specific dread that comes with getting what you wanted. They tied the horses in a draw below the ridge and went the last half-mile on foot, moving through the juniper along the high ground above the canyon's south wall. It was rough going. The rock was loose in places and the footing demanded attention, but it kept them above the sight lines of anyone in the canyon floor below. When they reached a point where they could see, Delaney went flat against a boulder and looked down. 3 wagons, as Harker had said. They were drawn into a rough line in a widened section of the canyon floor near what looked like an abandoned structure, a shack, maybe once a line camp for some long-gone cattle operation. 6 men that she could count around the wagons, armed. 2 more on the canyon walls opposite, positioned high. Lookouts. And at the center of it, near the shack's open door, A man she recognized from the back, the shape of the shoulders, the way he stood, weight slightly back, like someone who was accustomed to watching rather than doing. Silas Vane. She hadn't expected the physical reality of him to hit her the way it did. In the 4 years since she'd last seen him, she'd constructed him into something abstract. A name, a mechanism, a thing to be dealt with. The actual man standing 50 feet below her in the morning light was disconcertingly ordinary. Medium height, gray-haired now, dressed in a decent coat. He looked like someone's successful uncle. She became aware that her hand had closed around a rock at the canyon's edge. She made herself release it. Boone was beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against her left arm. He was looking at the men around the wagons, counting and cataloging the same way she had. 8, he breathed. Too high. 10 total, she confirmed. Wagons are loaded. They're moving tonight, or they'd have unhitched. We need to get back to Harker. Get word to Aldridge. She agreed with this. She also knew that by the time Aldridge mobilized from Prescott, even with Harker's wire, they were looking at the better part of a day minimum. Maybe more. And if Vane moved tonight... Delaney. Boone's voice had changed register slightly. Still quiet, but with a new quality. She looked at him. He was looking at the shack. The door had opened further. A man came out. One of Vane's people, heavy-set, moving with the specific deliberateness of someone running an errand they didn't particularly enjoy. He said something to Vane that they couldn't hear at this distance. And then, from inside the shack, sounds. Voices. More than one. The quality of sounds from people who have been in a confined space too long and are not there voluntarily. Delaney's stomach dropped and settled somewhere lower than its usual place. There were people in that shack. She felt Boone's hand come to rest briefly on her forearm. Not gripping, just a brief pressure. An acknowledgement of what they were both now understanding. This wasn't a staging run for a future operation. The cargo was already here. They went back the way they'd come, careful and silent until they were below the ridge and out of the lookout's sight lines, and then they moved fast. She didn't speak until they reached the horses, and when she did, her voice was lower than she intended. We can't wait for Aldridge. I know. If they move tonight, I know. He was untying the reins with quick, efficient movements. We go back to Harker. I wire Aldridge to push hard, and then we go back to Red Ash. She stared at him. There are 2 of us and 10 of them and no law between here and Prescott that can move fast enough on its own. He looked at her directly. But in Red Ash, I've got men who'll ride. And Red Ash has a reason to want Vane shut down. Half the women he's moved through this territory have passed through counties that touch ours. This is not just your problem, Delaney. It never was. She wanted to argue. She was already running the calculation in her head. 2 of them, 10 of Vane's men, terrain she now knew, the element of surprise. 2 against 10 is not a plan, Boone said. It's an ending. She looked back at the ridge, the shack, the sounds. How long to get back to Red Ash and come back with men? She said. Hard ride back. If we move now, I can have men saddled and heading back here before midnight. Reach the canyon before dawn. He paused. Vane won't move wagons in the dark through canyon terrain. He'll wait for first light. We beat him to it. She turned it over, hated it, looked at the math of it again, and arrived at the same answer every time. All right, she said, but we ride hard. We ride hard, he agreed. They hit Harker's office at a run. Boone dictated the wire to Aldridge. Canyon location, number of men, confirmation of active transport, request for immediate movement. Harker sent it before they'd finished watering the horses. Then they were back on the road north toward Red Ash, and Boone put the roan into the kind of ground-covering pace that big horses sustain when they're being asked to mean it. The land blurred past. Red rock, juniper shadow, the long, straight stretches of the territory road going gold in the late afternoon sun. Delaney rode and kept her breathing steady, and worked on keeping the sounds from the shack from occupying the center of her mind where she needed room to think. They were an hour out from Red Ash when the rider came up behind them, fast. Too fast for someone just heading the same direction. Boone pulled up and turned the roan, hand going to the rifle scabbard, and Delaney swung wide to the right automatically, putting space between them. 2 targets instead of 1, which was the right instinct, and she'd done it before she fully thought about it. The rider pulled up hard 30 feet back. It was Patch. He was breathing like he'd been pushing his horse since morning. His face was red and there was dust in his hair. And his expression was the specific expression of young men who have done something they know was against instructions, but have decided the information justifies it. "I followed you," he said, before anyone could speak. "From the ranch. I'm sorry, but Cal said you'd gone south and the direction wasn't for errands and I—" He stopped, caught his breath. "There are men at the ranch." Boone went very still. "How many?" he said. "4. They came this morning, about 2 hours after you left, said they were looking for a woman." Patch's eyes went to Delaney. "Said she had property belonging to their employer. Cal told them to clear off. They cleared off." Another breath. "Then they came back in the afternoon, more of them, 6 this time. They were asking in town about a woman staying at the Mercer Steak, about where Boone had gone. The road was very quiet, wind through the juniper, nothing else." Delaney felt the information hit her like cold water. They knew. Vane's people knew she'd been in Bridle, knew she was moving toward the canyon, somehow, through Harker, through someone in Bridle who'd seen them, through a connection she hadn't anticipated. The information had moved faster than they had. "Is Cal all right?" Boone said. "He was fine when I left. Rodrigo, too. They've got the place locked up." Patch looked at Boone with the expression of a young man trying very hard to be steady, and mostly managing it. "I thought you should know." Boone looked at Delaney. She was already recalculating. Vane's men at the ranch, Vane's operation in the canyon. Vane now aware that someone with operational knowledge of his business had been to Bridle and was asking questions. The timeline had just collapsed. "Patch," Boone said, "how fast can you ride back?" "Faster than I came. I need you to go back to Red Ash. Go to the sheriff's office first. Tell him what you saw at the ranch, and tell him I'm asking for deputies at the Mercer Steak tonight. Then go to the ranch and tell Cal to hold tight and not engage unless they have to." He pulled a folded paper from his coat, the notes he'd made at Harker's, the canyon location, the specifics, and handed it to Patch. "If anything happens to me, this goes to the Territorial Marshal's office in Prescott. You understand?" Patch took the paper carefully. "What's going to happen to you?" "Probably nothing," Boone said, "but carry it anyway." Patch looked at Delaney. Young face, honest eyes, the particular earnestness of someone who hasn't yet learned to hide it. "You'll be careful," he said. The same thing Rodrigo had said 2 days ago in the kitchen doorway. Different voice, same weight. "I'll be careful," she said. Patch turned his horse and rode. She watched him go, then looked at Boone. "They're going to move the canyon operation tonight," she said, "because they know we were there. They can't afford to wait for Aldridge now." "Yes," he said, "which means we don't have until dawn." "No," he said, "we don't." The road back to Red Ash was ahead of them. The road south toward the canyon was behind. The light was dropping fast, the western sky going orange at the edges the way it did before it went dark, and stayed dark for a long time. "We need help," Delaney said. Not as an admission, just as a fact. "Yes." "Red Ash is 40 minutes. 30 if we push," she looked at him. "Then let's go get the town." They pushed the horses hard and made Red Ash in just over 30 minutes, coming in off the south road at a pace that put people on the boardwalks before they'd even pulled up at the rail outside the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was a man of 52 who had held the job in Red Ash for 11 years, which meant he'd survived long enough to know the difference between trouble that could wait until morning and trouble that couldn't. He was locking his office door when Boone and Delaney rode in, and he took one look at the horse's condition and left the key in the lock. "Talk," he said. Boone talked. He laid it out fast and clean. The canyon, the wagons, the count of men, Vane's people at the ranch, the collapsing timeline. Pruitt listened without interrupting, which was a quality Delaney had learned to appreciate in the last several days as one of the rarer ones. When Boone finished, Pruitt looked at Delaney. "You were inside his operation," he said. 6 months, she said. "I know how he moves, and I know the canyon, and I know what's in those wagons isn't freight." Pruitt looked at the street. He was running the same calculation she'd run an hour ago. Available men, distance, time before Vane moved. She could see it in his face, the specific tension of a man who has authority and is deciding what to do with it. "I've got 2 deputies," he said, "both green." "I've got Cal and Rodrigo," Boone said. "They can handle themselves." "That's 7, including the 2 of us," Delaney said. 7 against 10, maybe more if he's added men since you left. Pruitt shook his head slowly. Those aren't odds I love. Then get more, Boone said. Pruitt looked at him. Who exactly are you expecting me to— The town, Boone said. Silence. Pruitt's expression shifted through several things in quick succession. Boone. These are shopkeepers, farmers. The man who runs the dry goods store has never fired a gun at anything that shot back. Then tell them they don't have to, Boone said. He stepped closer, and his voice dropped but didn't soften. Dale, there are people in that canyon right now. Women, most likely. And Silas Vane has been running his operation through this territory for years. And the reason nobody's shut it down is because it's always been easier to look at the newspaper and tell yourself someone else is handling it. He held Pruitt's eyes. We are someone else, and we need the town. Pruitt looked at Delaney. She didn't say anything. She'd learned that sometimes silence did what words couldn't. The sheriff looked at the street, at the miners' exchange where lamplight spilled through the windows and the sound of conversation drifted out, at the dry goods store, at the houses beyond the main strip where families were sitting down to dinner or getting children to bed or doing all the ordinary things that ordinary life allowed you to do when something terrible was happening far enough away to ignore. Give me 20 minutes, Pruitt said. He didn't go to the saloon. He went to the barber shop first, but the barber, a man named August, was closing up and had the specific status of someone that the town trusted with their faces and therefore trusted with most things. Then he went to the dry goods store, then to the feed merchant, then to 2 houses on the residential street behind the main strip where he apparently knew the men who lived there and knew what they were capable of. Delaney stayed with the horses. Boone went to find Cal and Rodrigo, who, true to what Patch had reported, had the ranch locked and were waiting with the grim readiness of men who had been sitting on a problem and were relieved to have something to do about it. She stood outside the sheriff's office in the gathering dark and watched Red Ash respond. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of unified, purposeful response that made for a clean story. Men came out of buildings with expressions that ranged from determined to frightened to the specific look of someone who has never done anything like this before and is hoping competence will arrive before they need it. There was an argument between 2 of them about which route to the canyon was faster. Someone had forgotten ammunition and had to go back. The barber, August, showed up with a hunting rifle that was clearly his primary outdoor activity equipment and had never been fired in anger. It was messy and human and real. And by the time Boone returned with Cal and Rodrigo, there were 11 men assembled in the street outside the sheriff's office, which was not an army but was considerably more than 7. Pruitt looked at what he had and nodded once, the tight nod of a man accepting reality. Then Delaney stepped forward. She hadn't planned to speak. She'd been standing at the edge of the group, close enough to hear Pruitt's briefing, far enough back that she was not quite part of the circle. But something about the shape of the moment, the men looking at each other, some of them uncertain, the weight of it not quite settled, made her step forward. They looked at her. She was aware of it. The woman from the wagon, Boone's dollar bride, the fat woman the town had watched get humiliated on its main street 6 weeks ago. She looked back. I know what's in those wagons, she said. Her voice carried without effort in the still evening air. I know because I was held by the same man who put them there. And I know that the reason he's operated this long is that the kind of thing he does is easy to not think about when you're far enough from it. She paused. Tonight, you're not far enough from it. Tonight, it's 4 miles south, and it involves people who are afraid and don't have anyone coming for them yet. She looked at the group. The barber. The man from the feed merchant. The 2 deputies who were barely older than Patch. I'm not asking anyone to be a hero, she said. I'm asking you to be the people you tell yourselves you are when it's easy. She stopped. That's it. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then August the barber cleared his throat and said, How many guns does this Vane keep? 10 that I counted, she said, possibly more inside the shack. He nodded seriously, as if cataloging this information. All right, he said. That was the moment the group stopped being a collection of men and became something with a direction. They rode south 20 minutes later, 14 riders, including Pruitt's 2 deputies, moving in a tight column that spread out once they cleared the town lights. The night had come down fully now, clear and moonlit, the kind of dark that was less dark than it first appeared once your eyes adjusted. Boone rode at the front with Pruitt, Delaney rode slightly behind and to the right, between Cal and Rodrigo. Cal said nothing. He was the kind of man who used silence the way other men used words, as a deliberate communication. Rodrigo said quietly, "You spoke well back there." "I just said what was true," she said. "That's what speaking well is," he said. They moved through the broken country in the moonlight, the horses' hooves muffled on the sandy soil, and Delaney felt the night around them like a held breath. A mile from the canyon, Boone called a halt, and they gathered in a draw below the ridge. "Two groups," Boone said, keeping his voice flat and low. "Pruitt, take 6 men around the north end. That's the access road, the only way out for the wagons. Block it and hold it. Don't engage unless they try to move through." He looked at Pruitt. "You're the stopper." Pruitt nodded. "I take the rest and come in from the south wall approach, the high ground. We have the positions and we have the numbers, and if Vane's got any sense, when he sees how many are above him, he'll know the play." Boone paused. "Best outcome is nobody fires a shot. I want to give them the chance to put down their weapons before we make it a gunfight." "And if they don't," Cal said, "then we're in a gunfight," Boone said. "But we give them the chance first." It was a reasonable plan. It was not a perfect plan because no plan that depended on other people's decisions was perfect, but it accounted for the terrain and the numbers and gave Vane a rational option that wasn't a body count. Delaney thought it was a reasonable plan right up until the point, 30 minutes later, when things stopped being reasonable. She was on the south wall with Boone's group, moving along the high ground above the canyon floor, when she heard something she hadn't expected. Horses, behind her, moving fast from the direction of the canyon's eastern entrance. Not the sound of men holding position, the sound of men who had been alerted and were moving. She turned. 2 riders, canyon wall riders, the lookouts she'd counted earlier, were coming along the ridge from the east at a full run. They'd been spotted, or someone had talked, or Vane's men had simply been watching the road and seen 14 riders heading south. It didn't matter which. The result was the same. "Down!" she shouted. The first shot came from the canyon floor, not the riders. Someone below with a rifle, firing up at the muzzle flashes that had bloomed in the moment of confusion. Rock chips exploded off the boulder 2 feet from Delaney's left shoulder. Then everything was happening at once. She heard Pruitt's group open up from the north end. They'd heard the shots and moved in, which was the right call, even if it compressed the timeline. She heard men below in the canyon shouting, not panicked shouting, organized shouting, the kind that comes from people who have drilled for this scenario. Vane's men were not the soft targets that some of the Red Ash volunteers had perhaps hoped for. Boone was beside her behind a boulder, rifle up. He fired once at one of the ridge riders, and the man pulled his horse away but stayed mounted. A miss, or close enough to one. The second ridge rider was closer. He'd split from the first and was coming down a scramble path on the canyon wall, trying to get below the sight line. Delaney watched his trajectory and moved before she fully decided to, cutting right along the ledge to a position above where he'd come out. "Delaney!" Boone's voice behind her. She was already moving. The scramble path came out on a narrow ledge, and the rider, she could see now he'd abandoned his horse and was on foot, came up over the edge with a pistol and found Delaney 6 feet away. They looked at each other for exactly 1 second. She threw herself sideways as he fired. She felt the shot pass her, the physical displacement of air that close firing produces, and hit the ground hard on her right side, knocking the breath out of her. The man was already repositioning. She had nothing in her hand. She'd moved without thinking, and she'd moved fast enough to not get shot, but not smart enough to have a plan past that point. He raised the pistol again. The rock she threw was not a plan either. It was pure desperation. She grabbed the nearest piece of loose canyon wall and flung it at his face, which was not a lethal move, but it made him flinch and pull the shot, and the second bullet went into the rock face above her instead of into her. She got her feet under her and charged him, which was, she would reflect later, an absolutely insane thing to do. But she was already moving, and he was off balance from the flinch, and she hit him with her full weight, and they went down together on the ledge in a tangle that was graceless and painful and involved her elbow connecting hard with his jaw, which hurt her elbow considerably but produced the more satisfying result of putting him briefly out of the fight. She got the pistol away from him while he was still seeing light instead of anything useful. Below, in the canyon, the gunfire was tapering. She could hear Pruitt's voice, loud, authoritative, The specific voice of a man who has decided that volume is his best remaining weapon, calling for surrender. She could hear other voices responding. She couldn't hear Boone. She stood up on the ledge, breathing hard, pistol in hand, and looked down into the canyon. Most of Vane's men were down or disarmed. Pruitt's group had the wagons. She could see Cal's silhouette near the shack. She could see the barber, August, standing near one of the wagons with his hunting rifle in both hands, and the expression of a man who is going to need to sit down shortly but is not ready to admit it yet. She couldn't see Boone. She scrambled back along the ledge to where she'd come from. "Boone!" Nothing. "Boone!" Louder. "Here!" She found him behind the same boulder, kneeling. He'd taken his hat off and was pressing it against his left forearm with his right hand, which was a posture she recognized with a cold drop of her stomach. "How bad?" she said. "Grazed," he said. "It's not—" She was already beside him, pulling the hat away to look. It was a graze, deep, bleeding freely, the kind of wound that was serious enough to need attention and not serious enough to be fatal if it got it. She tore a strip from the hem of her skirt without pausing to think about it and pressed it hard against the wound and watched his jaw tighten, but he didn't make a sound. "Hold that," she said. He held it. From below, Pruitt called out again. The tone had changed, the authoritative volume of a man who has established control and is now managing the aftermath. She heard someone respond, the particular quality of a voice complying rather than resisting. She looked toward the canyon floor. "Vane," she said. Boone followed her eyes. He could have gotten out during the confusion. East End. She thought about the Eastern Canyon entrance, the direction the lookout riders had come from. If Vane had seen the group incoming and had a horse ready. "I have to go down," she said. "Not alone." "You can't." "I can walk," he said, and stood up to demonstrate, which was more convincing than she'd expected, although she could see the effort in his face. "I can walk, and I can shoot with my right hand, and I'm going with you. Don't waste time arguing about it." She looked at him. "Stop looking at me like I might fall over," he said. "Are you going to fall over?" "No." A pause. "Probably not." She helped him over the rough section of trail, and they came down into the canyon from the south wall approach, coming out near the shack. Cal intercepted them before they'd crossed 10 feet. His eyes went to Boone's improvised bandage and then to Delaney's face with the efficient assessment of a man who's been in difficult situations before. "He needs the doctor," Cal said to her as if Boone were not standing there. "I know," she said. "Not yet." "Vane," Boone said to Cal. "Did he get out?" Cal's expression answered the question before he spoke. "East End. We found his horse gone. One of Pruitt's men is riding after him, but—" He stopped. "It's dark country east of here." Delaney looked at the eastern end of the canyon. Dark, narrow, the terrain breaking up into arroyos and rock formations that a man on a good horse who knew the country could disappear into for days. She'd waited 4 years. She could feel the specific cruelty of it. To be this close, to have the operation broken, and the men in custody, and the evidence sitting in 3 wagons under the moonlit canyon sky, and to have the center of it gone, slipped out in the chaos like smoke through a crack. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed. "The shack," she said. "What's in the shack?" "Pruitt's in there now," Cal said. "There are—" He paused, choosing words with unusual care. "There are people inside, women, mostly, some young." He met her eyes. "They're all right, frightened, but all right." She walked to the shack. Pruitt was inside with one of his deputies and the lamp from the wagons, and there were 7 people, 6 women and a girl who looked no older than 14, sitting along the walls. The room smelled of too many people in too small a space for too long. Most of them looked at her with the flat, shut-down expression she recognized, the expression that people develop when they've learned that showing fear or hope both get used against you. She crouched down in front of the youngest one, the girl. "Hey," she said quietly. The girl looked at her, dark-haired, thin, with a cut above her eyebrow that was days old and healing badly. "Nobody's going to move you again tonight," Delaney said. "You understand that?" The girl looked at her for a long moment, the evaluating look of someone who has heard reassurances before and has learned to measure them against available evidence. Then, very slightly, she nodded. Delaney stood up, turned back to the doorway. Boone was there, leaning against the frame with his bandaged arm held close to his body. He'd seen the room. She could see it in his face, not shock, because Boone had been around enough to not shock easily, but something close and quiet and angry. She walked out past him. He turned and walked beside her. They stood in the canyon under the open sky and didn't speak for a moment. Harker's wire will have reached Aldridge, Boone said finally. He'll be moving already. With what's in those wagons, documentation probably, Vane usually kept records, and the testimony of the women inside, there's more than enough to build the case even without Vane himself. Without Vane himself, she repeated. We'll find him, he said. She looked at the eastern end of the canyon where the darkness swallowed everything past 50 feet. She wanted to say something about Clara, about the 4 years, about the shape of how close this had come and how it had still fallen short by exactly one man. What she said was, "You need the doctor." "I know." "Cal," she started. "I heard," Cal said from behind them. He materialized out of the dark with the uncanny efficiency of a man who had clearly been waiting to say this. "I'll get him on a horse, you," to Delaney. "You should come too. Pruitt's got this." She looked at Pruitt, who was organizing his deputies with the tired competence of a man who has achieved something difficult and is now dealing with everything achievement leaves behind. He caught her eye across the canyon floor and gave her the same tight nod he'd given before they rode out. She nodded back. She helped get Boone on his horse. He accepted the help without comment, which told her the arm was worse than he was saying. And they rode north out of Black Ridge Canyon with Cal on one side and Rodrigo on the other, and 14 men behind them moving slower now, the compressed urgency of the last several hours draining out into the ordinary exhaustion that follows it. The canyon fell away behind them. The territory opened up. The night was very still and very large, and somewhere in the dark eastern country Silas Vane was riding, which was not finished, and she knew it was not finished. But in the shack behind them, 7 people were breathing free air for the first time in however long. That was real. That mattered. She rode north beside Boone in the moonlight and let that be enough for right now. The doctor in Red Ash was a man named Fitch, who had come west from Ohio 15 years ago with medical training and a drinking problem, had resolved one of those things, and had been practicing with reasonable competence ever since. He cleaned and stitched Boone's arm at midnight by lamplight, working with the efficient unhurriedness of a man who had done this in worse conditions and knew that rushing sutures was how you got infections. Boone sat on the edge of Fitch's examination table and said nothing while it was done, which Delaney noted. Not because stoicism impressed her. She'd known men who performed pain tolerance like it was a personality. But because his silence was the real kind, the kind that came from putting the discomfort somewhere it wouldn't interfere rather than making sure everyone saw you doing it. She sat in the chair across the room and watched and felt the events of the last several hours settle into her body as the urgency drained out. Her right side ached where she'd hit the ground on the canyon ledge. Her elbow was swollen from connecting with the lookout's jaw. She'd torn the hem off her best remaining dress and hadn't noticed until now. When Fitch finished and stepped back to examine his work, Boone looked at the stitching and said, "Good. It'll hold if you don't do anything foolish for 2 weeks," Fitch said. "Define foolish." Riding hard, fighting, lifting anything heavier than a coffee cup. He gave Boone the flat look of a man who knew exactly how much of this would be followed. "I know. Do your best." They walked back to the Mercer stake in the dark. Someone had brought the horses around earlier, and Cal had ridden ahead to open the place up. The ranch was lit when they arrived, lamplight in the kitchen windows, which was the most welcoming thing Delaney had seen in some time. Rodrigo had, inexplicably, made coffee, and it was sitting on the stove when they came in, strong enough to stand a spoon in, which was exactly right. They sat at the kitchen table, just the two of them. Cal and Rodrigo had read the room and disappeared to the bunkhouse with the good instincts of people who understood when presence was not required. The coffee was bad and necessary. "He got out," Delaney said. She'd been holding it since the canyon, letting herself finish the ride and the doctor and the getting inside before she looked at it directly. "Vane got out." "Yes," Boone said. "We have his men. We have the wagons. We have 7 witnesses and whatever documentation was in those wagons." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Aldridge will have enough to build the federal case. Vane can't operate without his network, and his network is finished." "That's right." But he's not finished, not personally. Boone looked at her across the table. The lamplight was low and his face was tired in a way that was honest rather than performed. The tiredness of someone who had moved hard and fast for 2 days and taken a bullet graze and hadn't stopped. Delaney, men like Vane, when their operations collapse around them, they don't rebuild. The money's gone, the infrastructure's gone. The men who know where the bodies are buried are now talking to marshals. He's running toward nothing. Machete. He paused. He'll surface, and when he does, Aldridge will have everything he needs. She knew this was true. She also knew that truth and satisfaction occupied different rooms in a person, and she was currently standing in the hallway between them. I wanted to look him in the face, she said. It came out simpler than she expected. I wanted him to have to account for it, not just disappear into the territory. She stared at the coffee. Clara deserved more than him disappearing into the territory. Boone was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. She did. He didn't add anything to that. He didn't try to reframe it or cushion it or find the bright edge of it. He just sat with it the way you sit with something that's true and hard and doesn't need improvement. That, she thought, was its own kind of comfort, not the cheap kind that asked you to feel better before you were ready, the kind that just stayed. I want to tell you something, she said. All right. When I went after that lookout tonight, on the ledge, she looked at her hands. I didn't think it through. I moved without a plan, and it could have gone very differently. It could have, he agreed. Not gently, just accurately. I want you to know that I know that. She looked at him. I'm not someone who doesn't learn things. I've spent 4 years being smarter than the situation I was in because I had to be. Tonight I was scared and angry, and I stopped being smart for about 30 seconds. You also got the gun away from him, Boone said, after throwing a rock at his face. Which worked. It was a terrible plan. It was no plan, he said, and it worked. Both of those things are true. He looked at her steadily. You were also the one who got those women out of that shack tonight. You were the one who spoke to that crowd and got them moving. You were the one who knew the canyon, knew the operation, knew what we were riding into. He paused. You can hold all of it at once. The rock and the rest of it. She looked at him for a moment. You're very irritating to argue with, she said. So I've been told. She finished her coffee. The kitchen was quiet around them, the windmill doing its slow rotation outside, the night pressing soft against the windows. She thought about what she'd said to the girl in the shack. Nobody's going to move you again tonight. The particular steadiness she'd felt saying it. Not false confidence, but something more earned than that. 4 years of surviving something, it turned out, gave you a specific kind of authority when you said it won't happen again. Not because survival was a credential anyone asked for, but because the person hearing it could sometimes tell the difference between someone who knew and someone who was guessing. She thought about Rodrigo in the kitchen doorway. You're not that anymore. Whatever you think it made you. She thought she was beginning, slowly, to believe that. 3 days later, Aldridge arrived. He came with 2 other marshals and a federal warrant, and the kind of organized efficiency that suggested Harker's wire had landed on a man who'd been waiting for exactly this information. He was younger than Delaney had expected, early 40s, with a precise manner and the patient eyes of someone who built cases the way good carpenters built furniture, joint by joint. He sat across from her at the kitchen table for 2 hours. He asked careful questions. He wrote in a small notebook with the concentration of someone who understood that detail was the difference between a case and a conviction. She told him everything. Not just what she'd told Boone, but further back, earlier, the specific mechanics of how Vane structured his operation to evade exactly the kind of investigation Aldridge had been running. When she finished, he set his pen down and looked at her. Miss Cross, he said, what you've given me is the piece I've been missing for 2 years. He paused. I want to be honest with you. Vane himself, we will find him, but it may take time, and when we do, you may need to testify. I know, she said. That comes with exposure. His lawyers will attempt to discredit you. Your history with his operation, I know what they'll do, she said. I'll testify. She held his eyes. I've been carrying this for 4 years. Getting up in a courtroom with it would be an improvement. Aldridge looked at her for a moment with an expression that was professional but not without feeling. "There's one other thing," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Not a warrant, something smaller, a page of handwritten notes. "In the process of interviewing the women from the canyon, one of them gave us a name that appeared in connection with an earlier vein operation. A girl placed in a domestic arrangement in the Flagstaff area approximately 4 years ago." He placed the paper on the table and slid it toward her. "Age 15 now. Currently in the care of a family called Whitmore. The Territorial Family Services Office has her listed." Delaney looked at the paper. She saw the name before she was ready to see it. Clara Cross. Age 15. Flagstaff. The kitchen was very quiet. She was aware of the windmill, of the chair under her, of her own breathing, which had become something she had to think about for a moment. "The Whitmore family," she said. Her voice was strange. "Good people, from what we can determine. She's been with them 14 months. She's—" Aldridge paused, choosing carefully. "She's had a difficult time, but she's stable. She's in school." Another pause. "She's alive, Miss Cross." Delaney pressed the paper flat with her palm, the handwriting under her hand. The name. She didn't cry. She'd made a habit of not crying in front of people she didn't know well, and she didn't break it now. What happened was more internal than that. Something that had been clenched in her chest for 4 years. Some muscle she hadn't known was permanently contracted, loosened, not released entirely. Loosened. The way a fist opens slowly, finger by finger, when you finally let it. "I can arrange contact," Aldridge said quietly, "through the territorial office, if you want it." "I want it," she said. No hesitation. "I want it." After Aldridge left, she went to the garden. She didn't know why the garden specifically. It was the place she went when she needed to be doing something with her hands while her mind worked through something her hands couldn't reach. She knelt in the dirt between the tomato plants, which had come back green and stubborn and producing more than she'd expected given what Cal had done to them, and she turned the soil with the trowel and let herself feel the full weight of the morning. Clara was in Flagstaff. Clara was 15 and she'd had a hard time, and she was alive and she was in school. Delaney pressed her hand flat against the soil. Red clay and sand, the mix she'd worked into it weeks ago. Things she'd changed about this ground, slowly, stubbornly. She thought about the kinds of damage that could be repaired and the kinds that couldn't, and the work of figuring out which was which. She thought about what she would say to a 15-year-old girl she hadn't seen since she was 11. She thought about the ways that conversation could go wrong and how she was going to have it anyway. She heard boots on the dry ground behind her and didn't turn around. Boone sat down on the edge of the nearest planting trough, not in the dirt, which would have been a gesture, and he wasn't much for gestures, and was quiet. "He found Clara," she said. She heard him exhale slowly. "She's in Flagstaff," she said. She's 15. She's with a family." She paused. "She's been there 14 months, which means someone helped her get there at some point. Someone—" She stopped, tried again. "Someone along the way made a better choice than I made, and she's alive because of it." "And because of what you did last night," Boone said. "That's Delaney." His voice was quiet but direct. "The women in that canyon. If you hadn't gone to Bridal, if you hadn't told me about Vane, if you hadn't gone back into that canyon last night knowing what was waiting in it." He paused. "Those 7 people are not in that shack anymore because of you. That matters regardless of anything else." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. And she did know. That was the thing she was still getting used to, knowing something true about herself without immediately finding the counter-argument. It was slow work. 4 years of a particular story about who she was didn't dissolve in one night in a canyon, but it had loosened the way the muscle in her chest had loosened when she read Clara's name. "I'm going to go to Flagstaff," she said. "Yes," he said. "You should." "I don't know how it'll go." "No." He didn't pretend otherwise. "Probably not the way you picture it. Things like that usually don't." She turned and looked at him. He was sitting on the edge of the trough with his bandaged arm resting across his knee and his hat pushed back, and he looked tired still, a week's worth of hard tired that didn't clear up in a few nights, and he looked like himself. Exactly and only himself. "When I come back," she said. He met her eyes. "When you come back," he said, and waited. I want this to be a thing I chose." She looked for the right words and found them to be simpler than she'd expected. Not a thing that happened to me. Not a place I ended up. She gestured slightly at the ranch around her, the garden, the barn, the windmill making its slow turn against the late spring sky. "I want to come back to this because I decided to, not because I didn't have anywhere else." Boone looked at her steadily. "That's the only way I'd want you to," he said. "I wouldn't know what to do with anything less." She nodded. She went inside and started packing for Flagstaff. The Silas Vane question was answered 6 weeks later, though not in the way she'd imagined it. He was found by territorial marshals in a mining camp outside Socorro. Not hiding, exactly, more depleted, like a fire that had run out of fuel. Without his network, without his money, without the men who had made him something to fear, he was an ordinary criminal of ordinary intelligence who had made his last miscalculation, assuming he could rebuild in new territory. He didn't rebuild. He was arrested on a Tuesday morning in October, and the federal charges that Aldridge had spent 2 years building were sufficient that his lawyers immediately began negotiating rather than fighting, which told the full story of how solid the case was. He would go to prison. For a long time. He would account for it, not in the face-to-face way Delaney had imagined, but in the slow public way of courtrooms and testimony and records, which was in many ways more complete. She heard the news in a letter from Aldridge, sitting at the kitchen table of the Mercer Steak on a clear October morning, and she read it twice and then set it down on the table. She didn't feel the relief she'd expected. What she felt was quieter and more durable than relief. The way it feels when something you've been dreading is simply over. Not triumphant, just finished. A door that had been open and letting in cold air finally closed. Clara was not simple. She wouldn't have been, and Delaney hadn't expected her to be. The first meeting in Flagstaff in late September had been difficult in ways that defied the script she'd written for it in her head during the ride there. Clara at 15 was not the 11-year-old she'd left behind. She was someone else, shaped by 4 years that had not been kind, and she had opinions and silences and a wariness that Delaney recognized from her own mirror and that broke her heart in a specific and accurate way. They'd sat in the parlor of the Whitmore house with Mrs. Whitmore diplomatically absent in the kitchen, and for the first 20 minutes neither of them said much that mattered. Then Clara had looked at her and said, with the directness of someone who had stopped waiting for gentle approaches to be sufficient, "Did you know what was going to happen?" "No," Delaney said. "I was 18 and I was wrong about what I was trusting." She held her sister's gaze. "I've known for 4 years that being wrong is not the same as not being responsible. I'm not going to try to make it smaller than it was." Clara had looked at her for a long time. "Okay," she said finally. Not forgiveness. It was too soon for that, and they both knew it. But something that cracked the door. They'd had 3 more visits since. Each one was a little less careful, a little more honest. Clara had shown her a drawing she'd done. She'd started drawing in the last year, which Mrs. Whitmore had encouraged. And it was genuinely good, the kind of good that surprised you, and Delaney had said so without adding anything to it. And Clara had looked at her drawing and then at Delaney with an expression that was not yet trust, but was its early architecture. It was going to take years. Delaney knew that. She was willing to spend years. When she came back to the Mercer Steak in early October, after the last Flagstaff visit, the ranch was in its autumn transition. The garden going to dry stalk, the pasture grasses brown, the sky that high, clear blue that New Mexico produced in the fall, like it was proving something. She rode in on the roan, and Cal came out of the barn and took the horse without ceremony and said, "Good trip?" And she said, "Good enough." And that was the whole conversation. Boone was at the fence line on the east pasture, working on a section that had needed attention since August. She walked out to him. He heard her coming and looked up. He looked at her face the way he always did, reading it honestly, not carefully, because there was a difference. "How is she?" he said. "Complicated," Delaney said. "Angry and funny and talented and damaged and figuring out what she wants to be." She stopped beside him. "She showed me a drawing of a red-tailed hawk, from memory. It was exact." Boone looked at her for a moment. "Sounds like her sister," he said. Delaney made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood. "She helped him with the fence. She didn't know much about fence repair, but she knew how to hold things and hand tools and follow instruction without requiring explanation. And they worked through the afternoon in the easy silence of people who have been through something hard together and have stopped needing to talk about it all the time. When the light started dropping, Boone sat back on his heels and looked at the repaired section. "Good," he said. "It'll hold?" she asked. "For a while." He stood up. "Fences always need work. That's just the nature of them." She looked at the fence line running out along the pasture edge in the low gold light. "I made a decision," she said. He looked at her. "I decided to stay," she said. "That's the decision. I decided it in Flagstaff, riding back." She met his eyes. "Not because I don't have anywhere else, not because you've been generous and it would be ungrateful to leave, because this is the place I want to be and you're the person I want to be beside." She paused. "I wanted to say it like that, plainly, so you'd know it was a decision and not a drift." Boone looked at her. He had the expression of someone who had wanted to hear something for some time and is now hearing it and is taking a moment to let it be real. "All right," he said. "That's all? What else do you want me to say?" She thought about it. "Nothing," she said. "That's exactly right." They walked back toward the ranch in the fading afternoon. The windmill was turning in the evening breeze, making its slow arc against the copper sky. The kitchen light was on. Rodrigo's Wednesday, which meant dinner would have opinions. From the bunkhouse came the sound of Patch badly playing a mouth harp, which he had been attempting to learn since August with genuine commitment and limited improvement. The ordinary sounds of a place that was alive. He stopped near the porch steps and produced something from his coat pocket. She almost missed it in the low light. A ring, small, worked from what looked like iron. Not a jeweler's ring. Something made by hand from material at hand, which was exactly the kind of thing she would have known he'd do rather than buy something in a shop. "I want to be clear about what this is," he said. "It's not me saving you. You were never in need of saving. You figured that out long before I arrived." He held it toward her, level and unceremonious. "It's me asking if you want a partner. In the literal sense. Someone to divide the weight with. Someone who's going to be stubborn about staying." He paused. "I've been stubborn about it since August, if you want the honest version." She looked at the ring. She thought about the crate on the wagon, the wooden sign, the men who'd tried to price her below the cost of a horse. She thought about the ledge in the canyon and the rock she'd thrown, and the way fear had moved through her and she'd moved through it. She thought about Clara at 15 with the drawing of a hawk. She thought about 4 years of running and the particular exhaustion of it and the particular relief of being done. She thought about what it meant to choose something instead of endure it. She took the ring, put it on herself, which he'd probably expected. "Yes," she said. "Partner." He nodded. Something in his face that was quiet and settled and meant it. They went inside. Rodrigo had made something that smelled considerably better than it had any right to, and Patch had given up on the mouth harp and was setting the table, and Cal was reading by the lamp with the portable contentment of a man who required very little to be at peace. The kitchen was warm, and the windmill turned outside, and the territory dark settled around the ranch the way it always did. Enormous and indifferent, and somehow, in the right company, not frightening at all. Delaney Cross sat at the table, her table, in her chair, in the place she had chosen with both eyes open. She had come to Red Ash in a crate, sold for $1, wearing her best dress and her worst circumstances. She had been mocked and handled and offered less than the cost of a barn animal. She had carried a guilt for 4 years that was real and was hers and was not. She had finally learned the whole of what she was. She was not a cautionary tale. She was not a pity case or a dollar bride or the sum of the worst things that had been done to her. She was not finished or forgiven or fixed. None of those words fit, and she'd stopped reaching for them. She was a woman who had gone into a canyon in the dark and thrown a rock at a man's face and gotten the gun away from him. She was a woman who had given a federal marshal 2 years' worth of missing information and meant every word. She was a woman with a sister who drew hawks from memory and a mother's garden to tend and a ring made from ranch iron on her finger. She was someone who had chosen and kept choosing and planned to keep doing it. That was enough. That was, she thought, more than enough. Outside, the windmill made its slow, faithful turn. The territory went on as far as it always had, brutal and beautiful, and entirely unconcerned with any individual story playing out beneath its sky. That was fine. That was honest. The story had people in it who would carry it themselves.